The dust was a living thing, a shroud of grit and sun-scorched earth that clung to everything. It coated Jedediah Stone's tongue, settled in the lines around his eyes, and powdered the brim of his hat. For 5 years, this dust had been his only constant companion, the silence of his sprawling ranch his only conversation. He rode the fence line not because it needed checking, but because movement kept the ghosts at bay. The ghosts of a wife's laughter and a son's small hand in his, ghosts turned to ash by a fire that had consumed his world. He was a man hollowed out by grief, living in the shell of a life that once was. That was why, when he saw the crumpled shape by the trail, his first instinct was to turn his horse, to ride away. It was not his concern. The world and its troubles had been banished from his land, from his heart. But the shape was too small, too still. A flicker of something he thought long dead, a stubborn ember of conscience, forced him to dismount. The heat rose from the ground in shimmering waves as he knelt. It was a girl, hardly a woman, her face pale beneath a mask of dirt and dried tears. Her dress was torn, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. And then he saw her legs. They were bent at unnatural angles, bound with crude splints of branch and torn fabric, the work of someone who inflicted the injury and then made a mockery of mending it. She was abandoned. Left to be baked by the sun, to be claimed by the coyotes. A cold fury, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, coiled in his gut. He looked at her broken form, a life discarded like trash, and saw a reflection of his own shattered existence. He could leave her. He could ride back to his silent house and let the wilderness have her. But the ghosts of his family whispered on the wind, their spectral voices a chorus of condemnation if he did. He gently lifted her into his arms, her body as light as a bundle of dry twigs, and a soft moan escaped her lips. The sound pierced the armor around his heart. He had just invited the world, with all its pain and cruelty, back into his life. Jedediah laid her on his own bed, the first person to touch its quilt since his wife, Martha, had last smoothed it 5 years ago. He sent his ranch hand, a quiet old man named Gus, to fetch Doc Abraham from the town of Redemption, a place Jedediah avoided like the plague. While he waited, he cleaned the girl's face with a damp cloth, revealing features bruised and swollen but possessing a stubborn, fragile beauty. Her eyes fluttered open once, pupils wide with terror, and he spoke in a low, rumbling voice he hadn't used for years. He told her she was safe, though he wasn't sure if that was a promise he could keep. When Doc Abraham arrived, his face was a mask of professional concern that fooled nobody. The doctor was a man who lived in a state of perpetual fear. He examined the girl's legs, his hands gentle. "This wasn't an accident, Jed," the doctor muttered, his voice barely audible. "This was deliberate." Vicious, he set the bones as best he could, his brow furrowed with a mixture of pity and dread. The next day, Jedediah rode into Redemption for medicine and supplies. The town felt alien, the noise and bustle an assault on his senses. He was tying his horse when he heard a booming voice that dripped with false piety. It was Silas Kane, the wealthiest merchant in the county, a man whose smile always preceded bad things. He stood on the steps of his mercantile, addressing a small crowd. "It is with a heavy heart," Silas declared, his voice ringing with mock sorrow, "that I must speak of my daughter, Ilara. A troubled girl, prone to fits and foolishness. She ran off, and in her clumsiness, fell and injured herself. She has brought shame upon my name." Jedediah froze, the name Ilara a branding iron on his mind. He turned, his eyes locking with Silas Kane's. He saw no grief in those eyes, only cold, reptilian calculation. Silas saw him, and a flicker of something ugly crossed his face. He strode toward Jedediah, his cronies flanking him. "You, the hermit. I hear you found something on your land." "Something that belongs to me." Jedediah's hand rested on the worn grip of his pistol. His voice was low, but it cut through the street noise like a razor. "She's not a thing. And she belongs to no one." Silas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "She is my blood, my property to deal with as I see fit. You will return her." The cruelty was naked now, the pretense of the grieving father stripped away. Jedediah looked at the powerful, sneering man, and then thought of the broken girl in his bed. In that moment, he made a choice. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over Silas. "She's under my protection now," he said, his words a binding oath. "You will not touch her. You will not come near her. As far as you and this town are concerned. She's my wife now." The collective gasp went through the crowd. Silas's face turned purple with rage. Jedediah had not just defied him, he had publicly claimed him a liar and a monster, and shielded the evidence under the most sacred vow a man could make. The declaration hung in the air of Jedediah's quiet ranch house for days, an unspoken promise and a terrifying new reality. Ilara drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, her whimpers filled with fragmented nightmares. Jedediah sat by her side, a silent, unmoving guardian. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm that he felt compelled to protect with his own life. He was a man who had sworn off connection, yet here he was, tethered to a stranger by a rash public statement. When the fever finally broke, her eyes opened, and this time, they were clear. Fear was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of searching intelligence. She looked at him, at the simple, clean room, and her first word was a whispered, "Why?" Jedediah had no simple answer. He just grunted, "You needed help." Over the next week, as she slowly regained a sliver of strength, she began to talk. The story tumbled out in hesitant pieces, a mosaic of horror that made Jedediah's blood run cold. Her father, Silas, hadn't just been in a drunken rage. It was a cold, calculated act of silencing. She explained that she had been in his study late one night, looking for a book, when she overheard a conversation between her father and Bartholomew Finch, a ruthless railroad baron known for consuming land and lives with equal avarice. They were laughing. They were celebrating a scheme to acquire the deeds to the lands of the small homesteaders in the valley, land they had no right to. They spoke of forged documents and bribed officials. And then, they mentioned a specific plot, the one that had been the most stubborn, the one that had required a more permanent solution. They spoke of the Stone Ranch. They spoke of a fire, a necessary clearing of an obstacle. The world tilted on its axis for Jedediah. The fire that had stolen his life, that he had believed was a tragic accident, a stray spark from a passing wagon train, was no accident at all. It was arson. It was murder. Silas Kane and Bartholomew Finch had murdered his wife and son to get his land. Ilara, her voice trembling, confessed that when her father realized she had heard everything, he smiled. It was the same smile Jedediah had seen in town, the one that heralded evil. He told her she was a liability. He dragged her to the cellar, and with a monstrous calm, he broke her legs with a length of pipe, telling her that crippled things had no value and dead things told no tales. He had left her on the edge of the wilderness, a broken offering to the elements. Jedediah stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The hollow space inside him where grief had resided was now filling with something else, something hot and roaring. It was rage. A pure, righteous rage. This was no longer about a stranger he had saved. Ilara's pain and his own were intertwined, two threads of the same venomous web spun by Silas Kane. His fight for her had just become a war for his own dead. The news of Jedediah's public declaration and Silas Kane's fury spread through redemption like a grass fire. People whispered in the general store and the saloon. They had seen Silas's cruelty for years, felt the squeeze of his financial power, but no one had ever dared to challenge him so openly. Jedediah Stone, the grieving hermit, had thrown a boulder into the stagnant pond of their fear. For Silas, this was an intolerable insult, but worse, it was a threat. With Ilara alive and under the protection of a man with nothing left to lose, his entire corrupt enterprise with Finch was at risk. He couldn't send thugs to the ranch, Jedediah was a known marksman, and his property was isolated and easily defended. So Silas turned to the tool of the powerful, the law. He visited Sheriff Brody, a man whose badge was polished with Kane's money and whose spine was made of jelly. A few clinking coins and a veiled threat later, a warrant was drawn. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction, accusing Jedediah of kidnapping, of holding Ilara against her will, of posing a danger to the community he had shunned for 5 years. The ink was barely dry before Sheriff Brody gathered a posse of 10 men, mostly hirelings and sycophants loyal to Silas. They rode out as the sun began to dip low, casting long, menacing shadows before them. At the ranch, Gus, the old hand, saw the dust cloud on the horizon first. "Riders coming, Jed," he said, his voice grim. "And they ain't friendly." Jedediah moved with a lethal calm he hadn't felt since his days fighting in the war. He barred the door, checked his rifle, and placed a pistol on the bedside table next to Elara. Her eyes were wide with terror. "He sent them for me," she whispered, her voice choked. "He won't let me live." Jedediah looked at her, at the raw fear on her face, and his resolve hardened into granite. "He'll have to come through me first," he vowed. The posse surrounded the small ranch house. Sheriff Brody, trying to project an authority he didn't feel, called out, "Jedediah Stone! In the name of the law, you are under arrest. Send out the girl and come out with your hands raised." Jedediah stared out the window at the circle of armed men, their faces grim in the fading light. He was one man, with one old ranch hand, against 10. Surrender meant Elara's death and his own imprisonment or worse. Fighting meant a blaze of glory and certain death for them all. He was standing at the precipice of a choice. A choice between his own life and the life of a woman who had already lost everything. He could surrender, give in to the darkness that had haunted him for so long, or he could make a stand that would surely cost him everything. What would you do? When evil stands at your door, do you open it, or do you barricade it with your very soul? Tell me in the comments below what choice you would have made. And if you believe in the power of courage, subscribe to this channel, because Jedediah Stone's fight is far from over. While Jedediah faced his impossible choice, a different kind of battle was being waged in the heart of Doc Abraham. After setting Elara's legs, he had returned to town, the girl's whispered, feverish confessions echoing in his mind. He'd heard her speak of the fire, of the land scheme, of her father's monstrous cruelty. For years, the doctor had been a silent observer of Silas Kane's tyranny. He had patched up men beaten by Kane's enforcers, treated families who had lost their farms to Kane's predatory loans, and lowered his eyes every time Kane strode past, a king in his self-made kingdom of fear. The doctor's silence was a heavy cloak, woven from fear for his own safety and a weary sense of powerlessness. He was a healer, not a fighter. But Jedediah's defiant stand in the middle of the street had planted a seed of shame in the doctor's soul. A grieving recluse had shown more courage in a single moment than he had in a decade. Now, as he watched Sheriff Brody gather his posse, knowing they were riding to commit a lawful murder, the seed sprouted into a thorny vine of guilt. He saw Brody's men ride out, and something inside him finally broke. He could no longer live with the man he saw in the mirror each morning. He grabbed his medical bag, not out of habit, but as a symbol of his purpose, to preserve life, not to stand by while it was extinguished. He didn't ride toward the stone ranch. He rode in the opposite direction, toward the small, scattered homesteads in the valley. These were the people Silas Kane and Bartholomew Finch were planning to ruin. They were isolated, distrustful of each other, and easy prey for a unified predator. Doc Abraham knew he was their only hope. He rode like a man possessed, his horse lathered and gasping. At the first homestead, belonging to a German family named Schmidt, he didn't wait for an invitation. He burst into their simple cabin, his eyes wild. "Silas Kane is stealing your land," he yelled, the words tearing from his throat. "He's using forged papers to sell it to the railroad. He's the one who burned out the stones." He told them everything Elara had revealed. The Schmidts looked at him, their faces a mixture of shock and skepticism. But they had seen the railroad surveyors. They had felt Kane's pressure. The doctor's words, spoken with the frantic energy of truth, landed on fertile ground. "He has the sheriff," Mr. Schmidt said, his voice heavy. "What can we do?" Doc Abraham's fear was gone, replaced by a burning conviction. "The sheriff has 10 men. We have 20 families. Jedediah Stone is making a stand right now. He's fighting for a girl Kane tried to murder. He's fighting for all of us. Are we going to let him fight alone?" He didn't wait for their answer. He rode to the next farm, and the next, his voice a clarion call in the twilight, a healer suddenly transformed into a revolutionary, trying to rally a sleeping army before the last bastion of hope was snuffed out. Back at the ranch, the silence stretched like a held breath, tight and suffocating. The sun had finally bled out below the horizon, and the world was painted in shades of indigo and charcoal. Torches held by the posse cast flickering, demonic shadows against the walls of the small house. Sheriff Brody was growing impatient. His authority was being challenged by a ghost, a recluse who was supposed to be broken. "Last chance, Stone," he bellowed, his voice cracking slightly. "We're coming in." Jedediah raised his rifle, its cold stock a familiar comfort against his cheek. He glanced at Ilara. The terror in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, heartbreaking resignation. She had accepted her fate. But Jedediah had not. He would not. He would make them pay for every inch of ground they crossed. He was about to return Brody's ultimatum with a single, definitive rifle shot when a new sound reached him. It was distant at first, a low rumble that was not thunder. It grew steadily, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from all directions at once. The men in the posse heard it too. They shifted uneasily, looking over their shoulders into the darkness. Sheriff Brody strained his eyes, peering into the night. "What in God's name is that?" one of his men asked, his voice shaking. The rumbling became the unmistakable sound of dozens of galloping horses. Then, figures began to emerge from the darkness, cresting the low hills that surrounded the ranch. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, homesteaders, their work-worn faces illuminated by the posse's torchlight, their expressions grim and determined. They carried hunting rifles, shotguns, and old service pistols. Men and women who had spent their lives battling the earth were now prepared to battle men. They formed a wide, silent circle around the sheriff and his posse, their numbers doubling, then tripling the men they now surrounded. Mr. Schmidt, the German farmer, rode his plow horse to the front, a massive, ancient shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He stared at Sheriff Brody, his eyes filled with a cold, clear anger. "You are on the wrong side of this, Sheriff," he said, his voice a low growl. The tables had turned with breathtaking speed. The hunters had become the hunted. Sheriff Brody and his 10 hired guns were no longer a posse enforcing the law, they were an island of corruption surrounded by a sea of righteous fury. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through Brody. The power he had projected moments before evaporated into the night air, leaving him exposed and utterly alone. Jedediah lowered his rifle slightly, a disbelieving hope dawning in his chest. He was not alone. The community he had turned his back on had come back for him. Just as the standoff reached its new, tense equilibrium, 2 more riders approached, this time from the main road. They rode with an unearned confidence, their expensive saddles and fine clothes a stark contrast to the homespun fabric of the assembled farmers. It was Silas Kane and the railroad baron, Bartholomew Finch. They had come to witness the end of Jedediah Stone, to see their problem solved and the final obstacle to their greed removed. Their smiles of anticipation froze on their faces as they took in the scene. Instead of a captured hermit and a defeated posse, they saw their own hired lawmen surrounded by a small army of the very people they were trying to cheat. Silas's face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. "What is the meaning of this?" he screeched at Sheriff Brody. "Arrest these traitors!" Sheriff Brody, sweating despite the cool night air, looked from the cold eyes of the farmers to the furious face of his benefactor. He saw no escape. He was a coward caught between a rock and a hard place, and his only instinct was self-preservation. He slowly, deliberately, raised his hands. "It's over, Silas," Brody stammered. "We're done." Finch, a pragmatic villain, began to slowly back his horse away, already calculating his next move, ready to cut his losses and disappear. But Silas was consumed by a blinding rage. He had been beaten, humiliated by a hermit and a broken girl. He saw Jedediah standing in the now open doorway of the ranch house, a silhouette of defiance. He saw Ilara behind him, her face pale in the lamplight. With a guttural scream of fury, Silas drew a hidden derringer from his coat. "If I am ruined," he shrieked, his voice cracking with madness, "I'll take you with me." He aimed the small pistol not at Jedediah, but at the source of his downfall, his own daughter. Time seemed to slow. Jedediah moved to shield Ilara, but he knew he would be too late. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't from Silas's derringer. It was the deep boom of Mr. Schmidt's old shotgun. Silas Kane was thrown from his saddle, his grand ambitions and monumental cruelty ending in a heap in the dust he had sought to conquer. A stunned silence fell over the valley, broken only by the sound of Bartholomew Finch spurring his horse into a desperate, panicked retreat into the darkness. Justice had not been delivered by a judge or a jury, but by the unified will of a community pushed too far. The war was over. In the immediate aftermath, there was no celebration, only a heavy, profound silence as the homesteaders looked at the fallen form of Silas Kane. They had taken a life, crossed a line they had never imagined crossing, but they had done it together, to protect one of their own. Doc Abraham moved through the small crowd, his presence calming, reassuring. He confirmed Silas was gone, then moved to check on Sheriff Brody and his men, who were now disarmed and humbled, their false authority stripped away. Inside the house, Jedediah knelt beside Ilara. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the violent release of years of torment. He put a hand on her shoulder, a simple, grounding gesture. The space between them was no longer filled with the tension of a protector and his ward, but with the quiet understanding of two survivors. Gus, the old ranch hand, began to put on a pot of coffee, his movement slow and deliberate, a return to normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. The farmers didn't disperse right away. They lingered, talking in low, hushed tones. They were no longer isolated families, they were a single body, forged in the crucible of that night. They had discovered a strength they never knew they possessed. Mr. Schmidt, his shotgun now resting peacefully on his saddle, approached Jedediah's doorway. He was a man of few words, but his eyes conveyed a deep, unspoken gratitude. "The doctor told us what Kane did to your family, Mr. Stone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are sorry we were not neighbors to you then." "We will be now," he nodded, a promise of solidarity that was worth more than all the land Kane had tried to steal. Jedediah simply nodded back, his throat too tight for words. He looked from the faces of the farmers, his new neighbors, to the face of Ilara, the woman who had inadvertently brought his world crashing down only to help him rebuild it from the ruins. The ghosts of his past were still there, but for the first time in 5 years, they were quiet. They were at peace. The long night was finally ending, and on the horizon, the first, tentative rays of dawn promised a new day, not just for him, but for the entire valley. 1 year later, the Valley of Redemption was true to its name. The fall of Silas Kane had led to the unraveling of his entire corrupt network. Bartholomew Finch was eventually captured and his land grab exposed, the forged documents brought to light by a newly emboldened town council. The homesteaders, now united by a formal pact, owned their land free and clear, their titles secure. They worked together, raising barns, sharing resources, and looking out for one another. The center of this new community was the Stone Ranch. It was no longer a place of silent grief, but one of warm gatherings and shared meals. The laughter of children, the children of his neighbors, now echoed in the yard where his own son had once played. Jedediah Stone was no longer a hermit. The hard shell around his heart had been cracked open, allowing light and life back in. He was a leader, a friend, a man reborn. And beside him stood Ilara. Her legs had healed. She walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder not of her father's cruelty, but of her own resilience. It was a mark of survival, a testament to the strength she had found within herself. She was the heart of the ranch, her quiet grace and unshakable spirit a soothing balm on the valley's old wounds. The rash, desperate declaration Jedediah had made in the street a year prior had blossomed into a quiet, profound truth. They were married not long after that fateful night, in a simple ceremony attended by all the families they now called their own. Their bond was not one of passion born in fire, but of a deep, abiding love forged in shared pain and mutual healing. He had saved her from death, and she, in turn, had saved him from a life that was no better than death. And so we find our moral. Courage is not a roar of defiance in the face of certain victory, but a quiet whisper in the dark that says, "I will try." It teaches us that one person's stand against injustice, no matter how small or hopeless it seems, can be the spark that ignites a revolution of the heart in others. True strength is not found in isolation, but in the bonds of community. And redemption is not about erasing the past, but about having the courage to build a future worthy of its sacrifices. Jedediah and Elara's story is a powerful reminder that even the most broken souls can be mended, and the deepest wounds can be healed, not by forgetting, but by fighting for something better, together. The story of Jedediah and Elara is a testament to the fact that our deepest scars can become the source of our greatest strength. They found their peace, a peace forged in the fires of injustice and tempered by the unwavering steel of community. Their journey reminds us all that when we stand for others, we are also standing for the best parts of ourselves. It is a story of hope, a story of redemption, and a story of the incredible power that is unleashed when one person refuses to let darkness win. If their story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of courage to change the world, then I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that will inspire you and reaffirm your faith in humanity. We are a family of viewers who believe that these tales of moral fortitude matter, now more than ever. Your subscription is more than just a click, it is a declaration that you, too, stand for the values of justice, love, and redemption. And your journey does not have to end here. There is another story waiting for you, a story just as powerful, waiting on your screen right now. Click on that next video, and let us share another tale that will remind you that even in the darkest of nights, a single candle of hope, when shared, can illuminate the entire world. Thank you for watching, and for being a part of this community. We'll see you in the next story.